केवलं ज्ञानमूर्तिं द्वन्द्वतीतं गगनसदृशं तत्त्वमस्यादिलक्ष्यम् एकं नित्यं बिल्लमचलं सर्वधी साक्षिभूतम् भावातीतं त्रिगुणरहितं सद्गुरुं तं नमामि. Shalom friends, we are on reading of your Vasishtha Maharamayan, third book on creation, that is Utpatti Khanda, and here we are on 37th chapter, the battle. Catalogue of forces continue. Vasishtha said, thus the ravaging war was making a rapid end of man, horse, elephants and all. The brave coming foremost in the combat fell in equal number on both sides. These and many others were reduced to dust and ashes. The bravery of the brave served only to send them like poor moths to the fire and flame of destruction. Know now the names of the central districts not yet mentioned by me that sent their warriors to the field in favor of the consort prince of Ila. These were the inland forces of Sursen, the Gudas, and the Asganas, the Madhyamikas, and they that dwell in the tropics, the Shalukas, and the Podmals, and the Pitpalyanas, the Mandyas, Mandavyas, Pandyans, Sugrivs, and Gurjars, the Pariyatras, Kurushtras, Yamunas, and Udumbaras, the Rajbaras, the Ujjains, the Kalpotas, and the Mathuras of Mutta, the Panchals, the northern and southern Dharmkshetras, the Kurukshetriyas, Panchalakas, and Sarasvatis. The line of war chariots from Avanti being opposed by the arms of the warriors of the Kunta and Panchanda districts fell in fighting by the sides of the hill. Those arrayed in the silk clothes, being defeated by the enemy, fell upon the ground and were trodden down by the elephants. The brave of the Sura, being hacked in their breasts and shoulders by enemy weapons, were pursued by the Banabhuma warriors and driven to a distant pool. The Santikas, being ripped in their battle in their bellies, lay dead and motionless in naked field, wrapped in their mangled entrails that were torn and devoured by the voracious Pishach at night. Veteran and outspoken warriors of Bhadrasiri, well skilled in the battlefield, drove the Amargas into a ditch like tortoises to their pits. The Hayas were driving the Dandakas, who fled like fleet stags flying with the swiftness of winds, gushing blood, drawn by pointed, piercing enemy arrows. The Daradas, gored by the tusk of enemy elephants, were carried away like broken tree branches in the floods of their blood. The Chinas, bodies mangled by darts and arrows, cast themselves in the water, their bodies a burden they could no longer bear. The demons, pierced in their necks by Carnatic lancers, fled in all directions like faggots of fire or like the flying meteors of heaven. The Sakas fought each other by pulling the other's hair as if whales and elephants were struggling mutually with their respective elements. Fleeing cowards were trapped in snares cast by the Dasarna warriors, like dolphins hiding under reeds are dragged out by nets on a blood-red shore. The Tongas, swords and pikes destroyed the Gujjar force by the hundreds and like razors shaved the heads of hundreds of Gujjar women. The luster of the warriors' weapons illuminated the land like flashes of lightning, and clouds of arrows rained like showers in the forest. A flight of the crowbars obscured the sun and frightened the Abhira warriors with the dread of an eclipse. They were as surprised as if ambushed by a gang of plunderers after their cattle. Handsome gold-collared, tawny-colored Tamras soldiers were dragged by the god warriors as captors snatched their fair captives by the hair. Like cranes by vultures, Tongons were beset by Kanassas with their blazing weapons, destroying elephants and breaking discuses. The rumbling noise raised by god warriors whirling their cudgels frightened the Gandhars so much that they were driven from the field like a herd of beasts or like the fearful Dravidas. A host of Saka warriors, dressed in black light, the mist of night poured like a blue torrent from the blue sky before their white robed fools, the Persians. The crowded array of arms lifted in the clear and bright sky appeared like a thick forest under a milk white ocean of frost that shrouds the mountainous region of Mandara. From below, the flights of arrows appear like cloud fragments in the air, and when viewed from above by the celestials, appeared like waves of the sea. The air was a forest thickly beset by trees of spears and lances, with arrows flying like birds and bees, and innumerable umbrellas with their gold and silver mountings, appearing as so many moons and stars in the sky. Kekias made loud shouts like the war whoops of drunken soldiers. Kankas covered the field like a flight of cranes, and the sky was filled with dust over their heads. The Kirata army made a murmuring sound like the effeminate voices of women, causing the lusty Angas to rush upon them with a furious roar. Khasias, bodies covered with kusha grass, appeared like birds with feathers and raised clouds of dust by flapping their feathered arms. The whirling warriors of Narmada's coast came rushing unarmed into the field and began to mock, deride, flout, and move about in their merry mood. Low-statured salvas came with bells jingling on their waistbands, flinging their arrows in the air and throwing showers of their darts. The soldiers of Sivi were pierced by spears hurled by the Kuntas. They fell as dead bodies in the field, but their spirits fled to heaven in the form of Vidyadhars. A mighty, light-footed army took possession of the field and in its quick march laid the Pandu Nagaras groveling on the ground. Big Punjabis and furious warriors from Banaras crushed the bodies of stalwart warriors with their lances and cudgels. like elephants crush mighty trees under their feet and tusks. Burmese and Vatsenis were cut down by the discs of the Nepalis. Saws cut down Sahayas like withered trees. Heads of white carp were lopped off with sharp axes. Their neighboring prince of the Bhadras was burned down by the fiery arrows. Matangajas fell under the hands of caste yodhas like old unchained elephants fall into a pit, miry pit. Others who came to fight fell like dry fuel in a blazing fire. Mithrag, Mithragarthas fell into the hands of Trigarthas and were scattered about the field like straws, and having their heads struck off as they fled, they entered the infernal regions of death. The weak vanilla force, falling into the hands of Magad army that resembled like a steed gently shaken by the breeze, went down in the sands like thin-edged elephants. Hades lost their lines fighting the Tongans and lay withered on the battlefield like scattered flowers fading under the shining sun. Hoslas were unable to withstand the war cry of the deadly Pauravas, routed by showers of clubs, arrows, and darts. Those pierced by pikes and spears looked like coral plants, red with blood all over their bodies, and fled to the sheltering hills like red-hot suns to the setting mountains. Flights of arrows and weapons carried away by strong winds moved in the air like cloud fragments with a swarm of black bees hovering under them. Flying arrows wandering with the roar of elephants appeared to be showering clouds. Their feathers appeared as the woolly breed. Their reedy shafts seemed like trees. Wild elephants and people of the plains were all torn to pieces like bits of torn linen. War chariots with broken wheels fell into pits like the broken crags of mountains. The enemy stood upon their tops like a thick mist of cloud. The host of stalwart warriors meeting on the battlefield gave it the appearance of a forest of palm and tamara trees, but when weapons chopped off their arms, they made it appear like a mountainous wood with clumps of stunted pine trees. The youthful maidens of paradise were filled with joy and glee to find the globes of their native hills, Meru, full of brave champions. The forest of the army howled in a tremendous roar until it was burned down by all devouring fire of the enemy. Hacked by the Assamese, their weapons snatched by the Bhutas, and the Sarnas threw away their staffs and fled like a herd of cows. The Kasiyas were there by their valor were eager to despoil the tinsels from the dead bodies of the chiefs, like summer heat drops the beauty from lotuses in a drying pool. Kushakas were beset by Mesalas with darts, spears, and mallets. The sly Katakas were defeated and driven away by the Narkas. Pontas were surrounded by Prastha warriors and were defeated like good people by the treachery of the Bible. The elephant drivers who had struck off the heads of their hosts in a trice were pursued by harpooners and fled with their severed heads like the lotus flowers plucked by their hands. The Sarasvatas fought on both sides with one another until it was evening, and yet no party was the loser or gainer, just like a learned discussion among pundits or lawyers. The puny and short-statured Deccans, driven back by the demons of Lanka, redoubled their attacks against them like smouldering fire is rekindled by fresh fuel. Ram What more shall I say about this war, which baffles even Shesh with its hundreds of hundred tongues and mouths to attempt a full description. With this chapter 37 and in the chapter 38 the battle end of the day, the battlefield after cessation of fighting. Vasishtha continuing, now as the war waged fiercely with mingled shouts on both sides, the sun shrouded his polished armor under the mist of darkness and fast about to set. The waters of limpid streams glided over the showers of stones flung by the forces that fell on the fading clusters of lotuses growing in them. The clashing of shafts and darts glittered like flashes of fire in the sky, and waves of arrows were seen, now approaching close and then receding at distance. Below, severed heads floated in whirlpools of blood like loose lotuses, while above, the sea of heaven was filled with flying weapons moving like marine animals. The rustling of the breeze and the whistling of clouds of weapons frightened the aerial masters and woodland apes with fear of an approaching rain. The day declined after it had run its course of 8 watches and assumed the graceful countenance of a hero returning in glory after he has fought his battle. The army, like the day, declined in splendor, being battered in its cavalry and shattered in its horse of elephants. Army commanders, in concert with the ministers of war, sent envoys to the hostile parties for a truce to the fighting. Both parties, seeing how much they lost in the engagement, agreed to a truce, and the soldiers gave their assent with one voice. They hoisted their soaring banners of truce on the tops of the highest chariots, and a mounted crier on each side proclaimed the truce to the armies below. They unfurled white flags on all sides, which, like so many moons in the gloom of night, proclaimed peace on earth by cessation from fighting. Then the drums delivered their loud peals, resounded by the roaring of clouds above and all about. The flights of arrows and weapons that had been raising like fire in the sky now began to fall in torrents of the ground below, like the currents of Lake Mansarovar. Hands and arms of warriors rested like their feet, like the shaking of trees and the surges of the sea, and after an earthquake. The two armies went their own ways from the field of battle, like inlets of the sea, running to the land in different directions. The armies being at rest, there was an end of all agitation in the field, like ocean waves were lulled to rest with the calm after being churned by Mandara mountain. In an instant, the battlefield became as dreadful as the dismal womb of death, and as deep and dark as the hollow pit of the sea after August sucked up its waters. It was covered with the dead bodies of men and beasts and flowed with the flood of purpling blood. It resounded with the sounds of insects like a heath with the humming of beetles. Gory bodies gushed with blood and gurgled like sea waves. The cries of the wounded wanting to live pierced the ears and throbbed the heart strings of the living, the dead and wounded rolling around side by side in streams of blood made the living think that dead were still alive like themselves. Big elephants lying dead in piles on the field appeared like cloud fragments, and the heaps of broken chariots looked like a forest blown over by a storm. Streams of blood flowed with the dead bodies of horses and elephants, and heaps of arrows, spears, mattocks, and mallets flowed together with broken swords and missiles. Horses were lying in their halters and harnesses. Dead soldiers were wrapped in their mail and armor. Flags, pens, turbans, and helmets lay scattered in the field. The wind rustled by the openings of quivers like the hissing of snakes or the whistling of the breeze in the holes of bamboo trees. Flesh-eating pisage demons were rolling on beds of dead bodies as if they were bedding on straws. The gold chains from the helmets and head ornaments of fallen soldiers glittered with rainbow colors, and greedy dogs and jackals tore at the entrails of the dead like long ropes or strings. The wounded were gnashing their teeth in the field of blood, like the croaking of frogs in a miry pool of blood. Those dressed in party-colored coats with 100 spots now had their arms and thighs gushing in 100 streams of blood. Friends wailed bitterly over the bodies of their dead and wounded lying amidst heaps of arrows and weapons, broken cars and scattered trappings of horses and elephants that covered the land. Headless trunks of demons danced about with uplifted arms touching the sky. The stink of carrion, fat, and blood filled nostrils with nausea. Elephants and horses of noble breed lay dead or gasping with their mouths gaping upwards. Streams of blood dashing against their rock-like bodies beat as loudly as drums. Blood gushing out of wounded horses and elephants ran like that of a wounded whale into 100 streams. Blood spouting from the mouths of dying soldiers flowed into 100 channels. Those pierced with arrows in their eyes and mouths uttered an inaudible voice with their last gasp of death. Those pierced in their bellies had their balls gushing out with a horrible stench. The ground was reddened with thickened blood issuing out of the wounds. Half-dead elephants grasped the headless trunks with their trunks, while the loose horses and elephants that had lost their riders were trampling over dead bodies at random. The weeping, crying, and tottering wives of fallen soldiers fell upon their dead bodies, weltering in blood, embracing them closely by their necks, then made an end of themselves with the same weapons. Groups of soldiers were sent with guides to fetch dead bodies from the field. The hands of their living companions were busily employed dragging the dead. The field had become a wide river, running with waves of blood, breaking into 100 whirling streams and carrying severed heads like lotuses and the torn braid of the hair floating like bushes. Men were busy taking weapons from the bodies of the wounded who lamented loudly on account of their dying in a foreign land and losing their arms, armor, horses, and elephants. Dying souls remembered their sons and parents, their dear ones, and their adored deities. They called out their names and sighed and sobbed with heart-rending sound. The brave who died cursed their fates, and those who fell fighting elephants blamed the unkind gods they had adored in vain. Cowards, fearing to be killed, resorted to base flight, but the dauntless brave stepped forward into the whirlpools of blood. Some suffering under the agony of harrowing stuck in their mortal parts, thought upon the sins of their past lives that had brought such pain upon them. Blood-sucking Vetal ghosts advanced with their horrid mouths to drink blood from headless torsos. Below the floating flags, umbrellas and fans looked like white lotuses in a lake of blood, while from above the evening stretched her train of stars like red lotuses in an ethereal sea. The battlefield looked like an eighth sea of blood. The war chariots were its rocks, and their wheels its whirlpools. The flag were its foam and froth, and the white fence its bubbles. The field of blood with scattered chariots, plunged in mud and mire and covered with broken pieces of wood, looked like a tract of land devastated by a hurricane. It was as desolate as a country burned by a fire, or like the dry bed of the sea sucked up by the sage Augustus. It was like a district devastated by a sweeping flood. The battlefield was filled with heaps of weapons as high as the bodies of big elephants lying dead about the ground. The lances carried down by the streams of blood were as big as the palm trees growing on the summits of mountains. Weapons sticking in elephant bodies seemed like shining flowers growing on green trees. Their entrails, torn and carried away by vultures, spread a fretted network in the sky. The lances stuck in the ground by streams of blood, made a woody forest on the banks of the Red River. And the flags floating on the surface were like a bush of lotuses in the liquid blood. Friends pulled dead bodies from the bloody pool in which they drowned, and men marked the bodies of big elephants by the jutting weapons sticking in them. Trunks of trees that had their branches lopped off by the weapons looked like the headless bodies of slain soldiers, and the floating carcasses of elephants seemed like so many boats swimming in a sea of blood. White garments swept down by the current looked like froth on the pool of blood. They were picked up by servants sent to search them out. The demonic bodies of headless soldiers were rising and falling in the field, hurling large wheels and discs upon the flying army on all sides. Dying warriors were frothing forth floods of, floods of blood from their throats, and stones stained with blood were inviting greedy vultures to devour them. Then there were groups of Sutal, Betal, and Uttal demons and ghosts dancing about the field with their war dances, whirling the broken bits of war chariots upon the flying soldiers on all sides. The stir and last gasp of dying were fearful to behold, and the faces of the dying and the dead covered in dust and blood were pitiful to the beholder. The havering dogs and ravenous ravens had pity as they saw the last gasp of dying. Carrion feeders were hauling and fighting over carcasses until many of them became dead bodies from fighting each other. Now I have described the sea of blood that flowed fast with the gore of unnumbered hosts of horses, elephants, and camels, and of warriors and their leaders, and the multitudes of cars and war chariots. But it became a pleasure garden to the god of death, delighting in his bed of bloodshed and grove of weapons strewn all around. With this chapter ends, and we will rest here after the chapter 38. And by the grace of Lord Ram, we will again meet tomorrow with chapter 39. Until then, Shivoham friends, Shivoham.